The valley was a coffin carved from stone, a place where every echo carried menace. SEAL Team 6 had walked straight into the jaws of an ambush. Fire poured from the cliffs on every side, bullets ricocheting off shattered boulders, sparks and dust filling the air until it felt like they were breathing grit and smoke instead of oxygen. 2 Humvees burned in the open, twisted hulks, coughing black smoke skyward. Their radios hissed useless static. Every attempt to signal for help with flares had failed, the green light trailing high into the dust only to vanish into silence. No helicopters came. No voices answered. The commander crouched low in the shallow cut of a crevice, a scarred map case jammed tight under his arm. His jaw was set, but his eyes betrayed calculation and dread. He had seen tight corners before. But this was no corner. It was a kill box. Sniper fire chewed away at every exposed angle. When one man leaned out to return fire, the round came so close, it took the edge of his helmet with it. Another was grazed across the arm before he had even raised his weapon. Every escape route was already sealed by rifles waiting in silence. The youngest SEAL, his face pale and streaked with grime, pressed himself against the rocks, clutching his M4 so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing came fast, his words broken when he whispered to the veteran crouched beside him that there was no way out. His magazine slipped once from his trembling hands, clattering against stone, and he froze, certain the sound alone would draw death. The veteran, older, broader, with dust caked deep in the lines of his face, reached out, steadied him, and said nothing. His grim silence said more than reassurance could. He had seen death arrive too many times to waste words. Bullets carved chips from the rock wall above their heads, the cracks echoing like bones snapping. The commander shouted over the storm to pop smoke, and a cloud of gray hissed into the air, only to be shredded by the valley wind that tore it apart in seconds. The smoke drifted thin, useless, revealing their position more than concealing it. His fist clenched around his rifle grip, the weight of command pressing heavier than the scarred map case. He refused to let go. Every second stretched too long, too sharp. Then it happened. Through the haze, from the far ridge, came a sound that did not belong to the enemy's arsenal. It was deeper, heavier, deliberate. One single shot cracked across the valley, and an enemy sniper, the one pinning the young SEAL in his corner, toppled backward. His rifle slipped from his hands, sliding lifeless down the slope. For a second, the battlefield froze, as if time itself had skipped a beat. The commander's head snapped up. He lifted his binoculars, glass smeared with dust, and scanned the ridgeline. For a fraction of a moment he caught it, a faint glint of light, like the sun striking glass or steel. It disappeared almost immediately. But it was there, the first flicker of something impossible. The young SEAL blinked, breath-catching, whispering to no one in particular that someone out there had their back. The veteran did not argue. He only adjusted his grip, eyes narrowing at the cliffs. Something in the cadence of that shot told him it was no accident. It was too perfect, too absolute. Despair still pressed down. Bullets still hammered the rocks, and the Humvees still burned behind them. But the air felt different. There was now a sliver, fragile and thin, like the crack of light beneath a door in darkness. It was the smallest thing, a single unseen hand pressing against the tide. But it was enough to hold men upright, enough to keep them fighting in a valley meant to bury them. High above the kill zone, Evelyn Carter lay pressed against the shale, her body molded to the mountain. The desert cloak she wore blended into the broken ridges, its edge torn and frayed where it had caught against sharp stone. Dust clung to her black hair, sweat streaking the strands across her temple. But her breathing was steady. Each inhale and exhale measured like part of the rifle itself. The Macmillan TAC 338 rested solidly on its bipod, Its legs sunk deep into the shale for stability. Through her scope, the chaos below looked both close and impossibly distant, as though she were watching ghosts fight for their lives. She had once been a name spoken only in hushed tones, a legend forged on a Syrian plateau when she pulled the trigger on a shot from 2,280 meters. That round had traveled across a valley so wide that most believed the attempt suicidal, yet it had found its mark. The record should have carried her to medals and classrooms where her name would be etched into doctrine, but she had walked away instead. Some said the mission that followed broke her. Others said she vanished on her own terms. The truth was a scar along her wrist, a reminder of one time she had been too slow, too human, and lost someone who had trusted her. That scar caught the sunlight now, a thin, pale line against the grime. As she adjusted her grip, below, the SEALs were still pinned. One of the younger men dragged his wounded teammate by the straps of his vest, boots scraping against the dirt as rounds cracked into the boulder beside them. The commander barked orders through the thunder of gunfire, his voice raw as he called again for smoke. A hiss filled the air, but the valley wind whipped it away before it could mask their position. The effort felt futile, the gray tendrils scattering like everything else they had tried. On the cliffs opposite, enemy fighters were bold enough to laugh. One leaned out from cover, a bright red scarf tied loosely around his neck, and shouted words thick with contempt. He raised his rifle like a trophy, waving it overhead as if the battle had already been won. Evelyn did not flinch. Her crosshairs rested calmly on his chest. She exhaled, her breath a whisper, and the trigger broke. The bullet snapped through the air, cutting off his laughter mid-taunt. He dropped, his scarf fluttering as it fell beside him. The silence that followed was louder than the gunfire. The SEALs felt it before they understood it. The young man fumbling with his magazine froze, his trembling hands stilling for a breath as he realized the enemy's voice was gone. The veteran crouched beside him, gave a slight nod, as if confirming something he had suspected since that first impossible shot. More gunfire poured from the cliffs, but the rhythm had shifted. The enemy was cautious now, peering out from rocks instead of standing tall. Another sniper leaned into his scope, aiming for the commander, and Evelyn's second shot took him cleanly before he could fire. His weapon clattered down the slope, the sound faint beneath the thunder of rifles. Down in the crevice, the young SEAL whispered that someone out there was watching over them. His voice cracked with disbelief, but his eyes were wide, filled with a fragile hope. The commander ignored him outwardly, focusing on keeping his men low and alive, but he raised his binoculars again when he thought no one noticed. His hands shook as he searched the ridges. Certain he had seen that glint once more, Evelyn shifted position, dragging her cloak through the dirt, her movement smooth and silent. Each adjustment of her scope brought another enemy into view, and each trigger pull ended with the same heavy silence that followed. Laughter died. Taunts went unanswered. The valley's soundscape changed with every strike, the chaos punctuated by the deliberate cadence of her fire. The SEALs began to move differently. Their panic softened into rhythm. Even the wounded man gritted his teeth as bandages were wrapped around his bleeding shoulder. Knowing that someone beyond their sight was cutting away the jaws of the trap, legends do not return with announcements. They return in the space between heartbeats, in the silence that follows an impossible shot. Evelyn Carter's silence was now shaping the living. The cliffs erupted with fresh fire as 3 enemy fighters broke from cover and began descending the rock face. Their boots scraped against stone, hands clinging to jutting ledges as they fired in reckless bursts down into the kill zone. They grinned even as rounds sparked near their feet, convinced the valley belonged to them. For the SEALs below, it was a death sentence closing in. The wounded groaned. The young soldier fumbled his magazine again, and the commander clenched his jaw so tight his teeth ached. Every angle seemed lost. Up on the ridge, Evelyn Carter shifted her weight, her knees digging into the shale until it cut through the fabric of her cloak. She ignored the sting. The bipod of her rifle ground into the rock, finding purchase. Through her scope, one of the descending fighters raised his rifle, his smirk lit with confidence. Evelyn's exhale blended with the wind, and her shot broke the moment. The man collapsed, tumbling lifeless down the slope. The second paused, startled, then tried to steady his aim toward the commander. She adjusted her position by inches, her cloak dragging across jagged stone, tearing another strip free. Her chamber clicked into place, steady and final. The second shot silenced him before his finger could tighten on the trigger. The third froze in disbelief, eyes darting across the ridges as if searching for the phantom hand that had ended his comrades. Evelyn's scope caught him squarely, and with a third measured breath, she erased him too. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames from the Humvees. The enemy had lost their reckless laughter. Down below, the young SEAL whispered again that someone was out there. His voice trembled, but it carried something new, a thin strand of trust. The veteran crouched beside him, gave a short nod. His eyes had seen patterns before, and this one was unmistakable. The commander raised his binoculars, dust clouding the lenses, and tracked the ridge. For a heartbeat, he saw her, not her face, not the cloak in full, but the way she braced, the stance in her shoulders, the discipline of her stillness. It was familiar, like a memory pulled from an old training reel. He lowered the binoculars quickly, his mind racing with names thought buried. The enemy adjusted. 6 snipers now repositioned, spreading across the cliffs with smarter formations. Their fire sharper and more disciplined. Bullets chewed closer to the crevice, one round knocking chips from the rock beside the commander's ear. He ducked, cursing, while his men pressed tighter against the stone. The valley was a crucible, and the pressure was unrelenting. Evelyn moved. She crawled low, boots sliding across loose shale, cloac trailing dirt behind her. Her rifle pressed against her shoulder as she found a new angle. The first of the enemy snipers leaned out, scope trained on the wounded man below. Evelyn's round shattered his helmet in an instant. She did not linger. She shifted again, cloak fraying further, the torn edges snagging on thorns. A second chamber click, another breath, and the next sniper dropped lifeless against the cliff. The rhythm was relentless. Position, scope, exhale, trigger. Each cycle was unbroken, each outcome absolute. The third sniper tried to find her, firing blindly into shadows, but she was already moving again. Her boots scraped, her bipod ground against stone, and her final shot rang out. The sniper folded, silent as dust. Below, the SEALs felt the change. Their cover was still fragile, the enemy still dangerous, but they were no longer alone. Every move they made was answered by an unseen shield. Despair had not vanished, but awe was rising in its place. They were surviving not by chance, but because mastery guided them from above. The commander lowered his binoculars, his breathing ragged. He wanted to shout for the sniper to identify, to demand confirmation of what he suspected, but part of him knew legends did not return with words. They returned with precision, in the rhythm of her fire, in the silence that followed each impossible kill. Evelyn Carter was reshaping the battle. The tide was turning, not with numbers, but with one hand steady on a trigger, unseen yet undeniable. The valley shook with a new sound, heavier than anything the SEALs had endured so far. From the north, 15 fighters poured down the slope, dragging with them a heavy DSHK machine gun. Its massive barrel glinted in the haze, a weapon built to shred vehicles, rock, and men alike. The fighters shouted to one another as they set the weapon on its tripod, their confidence rising with every second. Then the first burst tore through the valley. The .50 caliber rounds ripped into the boulders that had shielded the SEALs, blasting rock into dust. The crevice that had offered fragile cover moments ago now splintered under the storm, the air filling with choking grit. The commander ducked, his heart hammering against his ribs. His knuckles whitened as they clenched the satchel at his side. Inside lay maps, call signs, and notes he had sworn to protect. If capture came, he would have to destroy it, consigning months of intelligence to flames. His eyes darted to the wounded, to the young soldier, still fumbling with his rifle, and to the men who looked to him for orders. For the first time, the thought of burning everything flashed across his mind. Above them, Evelyn Carter shifted once more. The torn edges of her cloak dragged behind her as she crawled to a sharper angle, her body pressed low against the jagged stone. Her scope found the DSHK crew, 3 men working in rhythm as they loaded belts of ammunition. Dust swirled around her face, coating the sweat on her jaw. But her grip never faltered. She zeroed her scope on the gunner. A thick man braced behind the heavy weapon, and exhaled. The shot cracked, and he slumped forward, hands slipping from the grips. The second fighter scrambled to take his place, shouting for the others to keep the weapon firing. Evelyn worked the bolt with practiced smoothness. The chamber clicked, the rhythm of unseen protection. And another shot rang out. The second man collapsed across the ammunition belt. The third hesitated, his hands shaking as he tried to feed the rounds. But he too fell as Evelyn's bullet struck. For a heartbeat, the valley breathed. The gun had fallen silent, the storm of fire broken. Down below, the SEALs seized the moment. The commander shouted for them to move the wounded. 2 men dragged their injured comrade through the dust, boots slipping on loose gravel. The young SEAL stumbled, nearly dropping his rifle, but forced himself upright. His hands still trembled, but there was steel in his eyes now. Someone above was shielding them, and that fragile spark of belief gave him strength. The respite lasted only a moment. A red flare streaked into the sky, bright and angry, arcing above the cliffs. Its glow burned against the lingering haze, a signal to bring more. The SEALs looked up, faces grim, knowing that it meant reinforcements were already on the way. The commander clenched his satchel tighter, torn between protecting his men and the knowledge of what could come if the enemy captured their secrets. Evelyn saw the flare too. Her jaw tightened as she steadied her scope again. Exhaustion tugged at her muscles, each movement heavier than the last. Her cloak was shredded in several places now, strips hanging loose from where the rocks had clawed at it. But she did not slow. Her rifle cracked again, and another fighter dropped beside the useless machine gun. She shifted, boots grinding into the shale, cloak dragging as she found a new vantage point. Another round chambered, another shot, and another man fell. The enemy fighters faltered. They had brought overwhelming firepower into the valley, but their confidence wavered as the unseen hand picked them off one by one. They shouted in panic now, their bravado replaced by fear of a sniper they could not see. Every attempt to reload the DSHK ended the same way, with another body sprawled beside it. Below, the SEALs moved faster. Dust clouds billowed as they dragged the wounded further into cover. Guided by the rhythm of her shots, the young SEAL slipped again, coughing through grit that burned his throat. But when he looked up at the cliffs, his fear was tempered by awe. Someone was bearing the weight of the storm for them. The commander raised his binoculars again, eyes searching for that faint glint. For a moment, he thought he saw her form pressed against the ridge, the stance of someone he almost recognized. He lowered the lenses, unsure whether to believe his own eyes. Legends did not belong here. Yet every shot confirmed that one was moving among them. The valley was collapsing around them, yet hope pressed against despair with equal force. The green flare they had launched earlier still smoldered weakly in the dirt, a futile signal swallowed by silence. Now the enemy's red flare burned against the sky, a promise of more chaos to come. Between them stood Evelyn Carter, her cloak torn, her rifle steady, each shot carving space for the trapped men to live. She asked for nothing. She revealed nothing. Yet survival was being rewritten in the rhythm of her fire. One woman, unseen and unacknowledged, was holding the line so others could move. The commander pressed himself against the fractured stone, his lungs burning with dust and smoke. Enemy fire cut down from the ridges, the angles impossibly tight. A single round snapped past his head and buried into the rock behind him, close enough to shear a lock of hair and leave a ringing in his ears. He turned, his eyes wide. Realizing the sniper had him marked, another shot was already coming, high above. Evelyn Carter steadied herself. The scar across her wrist caught the fading light as she adjusted her grip, a thin reminder of the day she had once been too slow. That memory had haunted her across years of exile. But it did not own her now. She brushed the mark with her thumb, exhaled, and placed her cheek against the worn stock of her rifle. The air vibrated with her focus. She squeezed the trigger, and the round cracked through the valley, silencing the sniper who had nearly ended the commander. The commander flinched at the echo. His heart pounded, and he knew the shot had not come from his men. He rose slightly, anger and desperation lacing his voice as he shouted into the chaos, demanding, "Sniper, identify yourself." His words boomed across the valley, bouncing off cliffs and stone. A plea and a challenge both. No reply came, only silence. The smoke shifted with the wind, thinning just enough for a fleeting silhouette to emerge along the ridge. The SEALs froze where they crouched, every eye drawn to the figure that seemed to rise out of myth. A woman, draped in a torn desert cloak, her rifle braced steady, the scarf at her neck fluttering like a banner in the shifting gusts. For a moment, she stood clear against the horizon before the haze folded over her again. The young SEAL stared upward, blood still streaked across his cheek, his mouth slightly open, as if afraid to speak. The commander lifted his binoculars, his hands trembling now, the lenses shaking as he tried to fix her in his view. Through the shifting smoke, he saw the stance, the posture of someone utterly in command of her weapon, his breath caught, disbelief pressing heavy against the back of his throat. Beside him, the veteran SEAL narrowed his eyes. He had seen that exact firing position once before, years earlier, in grainy footage passed through training circles, like forbidden scripture. He whispered, almost reverent, "Evelyn Carter." The name seemed to hang in the dust, heavier than the gunfire that had moments ago threatened to break them. The young SEAL turned sharply, shock breaking across his face. He had heard stories, fragments of a shot across 2,280 meters in the deserts of Syria. A legend whispered more than spoken, but legends were not supposed to rise from the dead. His lips moved again, barely audible. "She's supposed to be gone." The veteran did not answer. His gaze stayed locked on the ridge, where the smoke shifted again and gave another brief glimpse of her. The scarf, the cloak, the steady rifle, and the unmistakable calm of mastery. Every movement confirmed what his heart already knew. The commander lowered his binoculars, his jaw tight, his breath shallow, awe warred with disbelief in his chest. He had thought her long lost, swallowed by the chaos of war, erased from record. Yet here she was, pulling them back from the edge, one impossible shot at a time. The team said nothing more, but their silence was louder than any cheer. In that moment, Evelyn Carter was no ghost, no rumor. She was there, alive, returning not with fanfare, but with precision that no one could deny. The roar of the DSHK had faded into silence, and for the first time since the ambush began, the valley seemed to breathe. Dust still hung in the air, rolling in waves, but the thunder of constant gunfire had slowed to bursts. The SEALs crouched low in the crevice, dragging their wounded deeper into what little cover remained. Their movements were sharper now, no longer the panicked scrambles of men waiting to die, but deliberate steps carried by the fragile trust that someone unseen was fighting for them. On the ridge, Evelyn Carter shifted her rifle, her cloak torn ragged against the rocks. The fabric dragged in the dust as she slid into a new position, her breathing steady despite the ache running down her shoulders and knees, her eyes locked on movement across the slope. A lone enemy fighter had broken cover, sprinting toward a fallen comrade's weapon. His chest heaved, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with desperation. He looked no older than 20, his face still carrying the softness of youth. Evelyn's scope followed him with the precision of a blade. She had ended dozens already, each shot taken with the cold certainty of necessity. But this time, her finger eased on the trigger. She exhaled, lowered the crosshairs just enough, and fired into the earth at his feet. The round cracked stone and threw up a cloud of dust, so violent it knocked him back on his heels. He stumbled, dropped to his knees, and raised both hands high, his weapon forgotten. From below, the SEALs saw it unfold. Their rifles had lifted, fingers tightening on triggers. But they froze as the boy surrendered to the dust. The young SEAL, face streaked with blood and sweat, whispered, "She didn't kill him." His voice carried awe, a disbelief that someone so precise could choose mercy in the middle of this chaos. The veteran SEAL, his arm bound tight with a bloodied bandage, nodded slowly. "She decides who lives and dies," he said, his tone more reverent than grim. The reprieve was fragile, but it mattered. Under Evelyn's cover, the SEALs dragged their wounded more quickly now. Boots scraping rock, hands gripping straps. With fresh determination, they moved with focus, their rifles lifted with steadier grips, scanning the ridges, not in fear alone, but in search of the unseen ally who shaped their survival. The commander barked orders, his voice low but firmer than before, weaving the team's movements into something coordinated. The enemy fire was faltering, their discipline broken by the silence Evelyn imposed, shot after shot. Evelyn shifted again, her cloak snagging on a jagged stone and tearing further. Another strip left fluttering in the wind. She ignored it. Her eyes tracked the ridges, her body still, her scope sweeping like a pendulum across chaos. Each motion was measured, precise. She had been gone for years, swallowed by myth. But here she was again, calm, steady, shaping life and death with the smallest choices. The commander, raising his voice to the cliffs, shouted again, "Sniper, identify yourself." His words echoed off stone and dust. But no reply came. Only the silence of a battlefield paused on the edge of collapse. The SEALs glanced upward, some half expecting her to appear, but she remained a ghost in the haze. Her shots answered when needed. Nothing more. The spared fighter's raised hands lingered in the minds of the SEALs long after he had been dragged away by his own alive because she had chosen it. That image stayed sharp against the dust and blood, a reminder that this protector was not simply a weapon. She was something more, someone who carried restraint into a place where it did not belong. The valley remained tense, the storm not fully passed. But for a fleeting stretch of time, the SEALs felt the impossible. They felt reprieve, and they understood, without speaking it aloud, that their survival lay in the hands of a legend who had no need to be seen, no need to join them. She remained apart, unseen but undeniable. The last echoes of gunfire rolled off the cliffs and were swallowed by the wind. For a long moment, the valley was only dust and silence. The enemy's advance had broken apart, their discipline shattered under the relentless precision of shots they could never trace. Survivors scattered into the mountains, their silhouettes shrinking against the ridgelines until they were gone. What remained were burning vehicles, broken weapons, and the bruised breath of men who had thought their lives finished. SEAL Team 6 regrouped in the crevice, dragging their wounded into tighter formation. The broad-shouldered man, arm bound with torn fabric, winced but gave a short nod as a medic checked him over. The young SEAL, hands still trembling, kept scanning the ridges as if afraid she might vanish, before he truly believed she had ever been there. The commander stood apart, his binoculars lowered, the scarred map case heavy at his side, his eyes lifted to the cliffs, and his voice carried through the valley. "Sniper, identify yourself." The words cracked against stone, but the only reply was wind. The SEALs listened, waiting. But the ridges gave no sign. They shifted gear from wrecked Humvees, salvaging ammunition, checking rifles. Every sound seemed too loud, too alive. Against the expectation that another shot might ring out, the commander raised his voice once more, straining against the emptiness. "Sniper, this is Commander Hale. Identify yourself." Still nothing. The dust swirled across the valley floor, erasing tracks, cloaking the high ground in a shifting veil. Then, with no warning, the radio on Hale's chest cracked alive. Static burst through, rough and broken, and every man froze. Out of that distortion came a single, calm voice, low and steady. "Night Viper. Mission complete." The valley itself seemed to hold its breath. The name hit like a hammer. Night Viper. A call sign buried in classified files, whispered only in training rooms. Thought long, extinguished. The young SEAL's mouth opened in disbelief, his voice breaking to a whisper. "It's her." The veteran closed his eyes briefly, almost in reverence. Before gripping his rifle tighter, Commander Hale stood rooted, the radio pressed to his chest, his jaw tight, his binoculars slipping from his hand into the dust. But there was nothing more. The line went dead, static fading into silence. On the ridge, a faint shape moved through the haze, cloak blending with the desert stone. For a heartbeat, she was visible, scarf catching in the wind like a banner of a ghost. And then she was gone. Dust rose again, swallowing her outline, erasing her presence as if she had never existed. The SEALs watched, their eyes wide, waiting for another word, another shot. But there was only the valley and the weight of her absence. The broken radio lay heavy, its casing cracked from earlier fire, now carrying a voice that proved what they had all suspected. Proof, yet untouchable. The commander finally exhaled and lowered the radio. His face, a mixture of awe and grief. There would be no thanks given, no answers, only a code name carried in static and silence. He looked once more at the ridges, then turned back to his team. "Move," he said quietly. The SEALs shouldered their wounded and heavy packs, boots crunching over shattered rock. None of them spoke her name aloud. Though the word lingered unspoken between them, the dust thickened, swirling behind them, blotting out the ridge and the legend who had saved them. Evelyn Carter was gone again, as she had been before, retreating into silence, leaving only whispers in her wake. The return to base carried no celebration, dust-streaked and heavy with fatigue. The SEALs moved like men who had walked out of their own graves. The wounded were rushed into triage, their moans swallowed by the hum of generators and hurried voices of medics. The broad-shouldered SEAL, his arm strapped in a sling, gave a faint nod as a corpsman checked his pulse. The young SEAL sat on a cot nearby, eyes wide and restless, whispering under his breath about the impossible shots that had saved them. His words tumbled in fragments, one shot, one kill. Every time. None of it sounded real, even as he spoke it. Commander Hale filed his report that night. The scarred journal and maps placed back in his satchel. The language was clipped. Vogge. Enemy ambush neutralized. Survivors returned with casualties. No mention of the glint on the ridge or the single voice that had cracked through static. He closed the folder knowing the truth could never live in official lines. Yet whispers had already begun. In the barracks, men spoke of an unseen sniper, a shadow who cut the enemy down before they could strike. The young SEAL pressed the veteran for answers, his voice low but urgent. It had to be her, didn't it? The veteran, his beard streaked with gray, kept his gaze fixed on a grainy ridge photograph taped above his bunk. He finally answered with a simple nod. Nobody else shoots like that. Classified channels stirred as well. Analysts compared the distances, the timing, the unerring precision. A name surfaced quietly, never written into the record, but spoken with unease. Evelyn Carter, the ghost of Jacok, long presumed dead in a Syria operation that had vanished into silence. Officers muttered in corridors, their voices dropping to whispers when others passed. Nothing confirmed. Nothing denied. On the other side of the fight, the enemy's confidence faltered. The fighters who had laid the ambush were hunted in follow-up raids. Their leaders dragged out of caves or cut down on mountain paths. Maps uncovered in those raids showed their plan unraveling. Confidence shattered by an invisible hand that had turned their perfect trap into ruin. They spoke, too, of the shots that came from nowhere, of men falling before they could fire. Their morale broke on the story of someone they never saw. Evelyn Carter was gone by then, her silhouette swallowed once more by the mountains. She walked alone along a ridge path, rifle slung across her back, her cloak torn and dust-stained. She left no tracks. The wind would not erase. Her silence weighed more than any metal, a burden she chose to carry. The legend would endure, carried not in reports or briefings, but in memory and whispers. The SEALs knew, the enemy knew, and in the space between, a myth took shape. Evelyn Carter did not need to speak her name. The mountains spoke it for her.